A musket was a muzzle-loaded long gun first developed in the 16th century. The major parts were the lock, stock, and barrel, which was smooth-bored. The soldier had to stand with the musket upright, load the ball and powder from a paper cartridge, and ramrod it in place. The hammer was pulled back, then the trigger pulled to strike a spark to ignite the powder. The musket was not replaced until the breech-loading rifles with self-contained cartridges made reliable by Winchester by the mid-19th century. Muskets were made by hand, each one unique, making it hard to repair, particularly true of the complex lock. Two problems. First, the musket could have been poorly made. Second, replacing parts was cumbersome, requiring a gunsmith. Interchangeable parts are effectively identical and fit on an assembly line without customization. They are cheaper to build, easier to replace, and more reliable. Interchangeable parts were expected with the Industrial Revolution, but proved hard to achieve. A major issue for firearms, not so much for textiles. Okay, lock, stock, and barrel. The stock was wood, the work of a carpenter. The barrel started as a flat piece of iron, heated, then hammered into shape. The finished barrel had to be straight. As a smooth-bore weapon, accuracy and range were limited. The flintlock was the mechanism to initiate firing. A piece of flint was held in place by jaws at the end of a hammer. The hammer was pulled back into the cocked position. Pulling the trigger sent the hammer to a flash pan, which created a spark, igniting the gunpowder, causing the weapon to fire. Misfires were common, therefore an expert gunsmith was important. There were also bayonets and ramrods to build. Eli Whitney had no experience at muskets until he got a War Department contract to produce them in 1798, which expected a war with France. He built 10 muskets in 1801 in a demonstration for Congress, each containing similar parts and mechanisms. Whitney disassembled them and placed the parts in a pile, then reassembled the firearms. Wow! Interchangeable parts! How did he do it? Well, Whitney's gunsmiths worked diligently to make sure that the parts fit good enough on all 10, a unique form of customization. In other words, the event was staged. Whitney and other musket makers overpromised, underperformed, and delivered late, all common characteristics for defense contracting. The earlier military contract for 10,000 muskets was fulfilled by Whitney, but not until 1809. Of course, he had excuses. A good musket is a complicated engine and difficult to make. Whitney had to start from scratch, constructing the building and water wheel. The flintlock parts had to be made, then shaped using welding and grinding, plus the woodworking of the stock and shaping the barrel. The Whitney Armory existed for 90 years with increasing degrees of interchangeability. In total, the Springfield Armory listed 195 separate operations for building a musket, some by water power, others by hand. Whitney made some progress but never succeeded at interchangeability. Other musket makers probably came closer, including Connecticut manufacturer Simeon North, who built in bulk using a standard die for lock plates, but still used trimming and fitting. North was credited with the first milling machines in 1818. Part of the reason for his success may have been that his brother-in-law was a clockmaker. Clockmakers were initially master craftsmen starting in the 15th century, and clocks were entirely handmade. American clockmaking started with Connecticut inventor Eli Terry, who received a patent in 1803. Terry used water power to operate his equipment, introduced mass production, and made thousands of clocks which were affordable by the middle class. Terry is given credit for accomplishing interchangeable parts. It was a complex process, starting with wooden clock wheels and using machine saws, lathes, and jigs. Thus, most internal parts were manufactured and interchangeable and then easy to assemble. He kept improving the manufacturing process and lived to almost 80. Terry and other clockmakers introduced mass marketing using a peddler network. When the price of brass dropped, more clock parts were made of it. Terry's practices were widely pirated, seemingly an American tradition. High wages, a relative term, and a growing population meant the potential for mass markets. More Americans got the entrepreneurial bug, and there was a drive towards mass production and distribution in seemingly every field. But that was initially limited to the East Coast market. That changed with the building of the Erie Canal. Next time on Food History and Mystery.